This is a production of Cornell University.
All right, thank you, Dave. Yeah, I'm glad that Lynn Knight presented a few of the details about the partial budget analysis because I'm gonna follow up on that a little bit. That's what this survey was in part about. So quick background story is that I started working with Dave with the New York State Soil Health Initiative last fall, and Dave had this idea to expand upon the idea of these case studies and look at a little bit of a broader picture of the costs and the benefits that farmers were experiencing across the state and try to capture many different types of cropping systems. So Dave and I came up with this questionnaire that we distributed to farmers across the state during the fall and the winter of last year. And overall, we collected 182 responses covering almost all the counties in New York. And we broke those down into, we asked farmers to report the types of crops that they grew, some of the practices that they used, especially focusing on cover crops, reduced tillage, and soil amendments, which included organic matter like manure, compost, mulch, wood chips, things like that. So we got a pretty good representation across the state, especially capturing some of these more active agricultural districts. You can see here in this slide. And then one of the more interesting things right up front that came out of this was that we asked farmers to indicate some of the major constraints that they were seeing on their farm. And the top three that rose to the top here were poor drainage, soil compaction, and soil erosion. And all three of these are really problems that can be addressed with reduced tillage, cover crops, and organic matter amendments. So this slide is a simplified version of the table that you might see on the handout that you have. And what we did here is we asked farmers to identify the cost, or in this one, the benefits of reduced tillage that they were seeing. And again, going back to Lynn's talk, these could be increases in income or reductions in expenses. And what really came to the top here is for reduced tillage, less labor was a big one. And another aspect of this result here is that we separated out farmers who were using reduced tillage on exclusively vegetable crops and exclusively corn and soy. And we were interested in looking at those two groups and seeing if they were seeing different benefits. And indeed, there were a few differences. This next slide is a simple illustration of those differences. You can see the vegetables on the green there, and the corn and soy is yellow. And this is showing that vegetable growers reported that they're seeing greater yields from the reduced tillage practices at a higher rate than the corn and soy growers. And then, of course, on the left there, you can see the overall rate at which producers were reporting greater yields, which is significant. It's above 50% there. And we also looked at the benefits of cover crops. Again, we separated out the corn and the soy growers and the vegetable growers, compared those two groups. And again, we see that they have they're experiencing different benefits. And also it's really noticeable that the erosion control benefit of the cover crops is really noticeable. Over 95% of corn and soy growers are reporting that benefit. So that's really number one for the cover crops. And then a couple more illustrations here of the differences between the two crop groups. Again, we see that the vegetable growers are the green there, and they're reporting almost at an 80% rate greater cash crop yields when they're using their cover crops. But we're not really seeing that benefit quite as much in the corn and soy. However, the corn and soy growers do see other benefits. Here we see that they're sort of combining cover crops with their livestock operations and using those cover crops as animal forage. So that's a benefit they're seeing. But again, vegetable growers tend to have less integration, I think, with livestock, and so they're not seeing those benefits. And so David Montgomery especially just talked about how farmers can use these practices to build their organic matter over some amount of time, and that's really important, is trying to figure out how long some of those changes might take. These farmers that completed the survey, they told us basically how long they'd been doing these practices, and we grouped them by their experience level: 1 to 5 years, 5 to 10 years, 10 to 20, and 20 plus years. And what we saw were some pretty interesting patterns that emerged from this. This slide is showing the percentage of each group that practices reduced tillage, the percentage of each group reporting less erosion. And we can see here pretty clearly, as time goes on your x-axis there, you're approaching 20 plus years, and the percent of farmers reporting less erosion is almost at 100%. Whereas if we start down here and we look at the 1 to 5 year group here, we're only at about 65% there. So two things maybe to note here is that you do see some benefits right away, but the likelihood that you're going to see those benefits increase over time is evident. And we use the chi-square test there to show that that's a significant association. Same thing here. This is also a really interesting result, not necessarily related to soil health, but we're seeing that the more experienced farmers who've been doing reduced tillage longer, they're taking better advantage of these cost share programs. So this could be a way to an area of improvement in terms of policy, maybe outreach, trying to get some of these farmers who are getting started, trying to get them enrolled in some of these programs. And finally, we're seeing kind of a bump in yields at about 10 years. So once these farmers have been using cover crops for 10 years, the percentage of them that report greater yields is really jumping up. So I think that's a little bit of an indication that it takes time for these practices to fully benefit the farmer and the producer. And finally, we looked at the ability of these different practices to provide resilience to extreme weather events. So I guess the future climate is unknown, but it's anticipated that severe rainfall might become more frequent, and also drought is a possibility. So both cover crops and reduced tillage can improve your soil organic matter, and that can theoretically improve your resilience to some of these extreme weather events. But we kind of wanted to test this hypothesis. And again, this is the results of 182 farmers using these practices, and we're seeing basically the best performances from cover crops, I would say overall, but there could be some wiggle room there. But I guess that's the takeaway here, is that both cover crops and reduced tillage are providing resilience to help farmers make it through droughts, helping them create soils that retain their water better, and also helping prevent erosion that might happen when they experience a heavy rainfall event. So I guess I could take a couple questions, and I guess I'd like to also add that there is this handout in the packet, but we're going to be writing up and publishing some future papers and stuff like that. So keep an eye out for it. Any questions?
Greater yield, how come we're down at 20 years?
I can't really say that that's. I can't really say that that's that's a real difference. I think so. These bars are going to have a certain degree of uncertainty. It's not like that's exactly what the rate is going to be. So there's a little bit of wiggle room there. The important thing to look at is the chi-square p-value. So that's showing that there is an association between the length of time that the farmer's been doing the practice and the likelihood that they responded they were getting greater yields. So again, I mean, this is also a very complicated system that we're looking at. So there could be, there could be other things that come into play there. I can't really say for sure, but we do know that there's a pattern here. Anybody else? Yeah, go ahead. I would say it's, yeah, I mean, there's definitely some other things going on here. Like we also found that there was a little bit of a tendency for some of these farmers that have been doing the practices longer or growing certain crops and not others. So to really get to the bottom of this, I think we'd have to do some kind of more involved modeling that would really tease out how all of these factors affect yields, for example. Does that answer your question? Right. It was how basically how long have you been using this practice? So it could, there could be it could be something like that. Maybe older farmers used slightly different practices and that. Right. Yeah, it was about the perception of the result. So we didn't explicitly ask that. I would imagine it would be both. We didn't really discriminate. And again, it was farms of all sizes, all crop types. And yeah, I suggest you look for one of the publications, or my contact information is on there if you want to get in touch with us, and we can send you some more information. Actually, one interesting thing that I just remembered was that there was one farmer who wrote in a response that basically indicated that the rent that they paid to the landowner somehow went down. Maybe they had some sort of, they negotiated or whatever, but that was an interesting thing that somebody just wrote in. So, yeah, thank you.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.